Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to review the GoToWebinar meeting control panel. You should see the attending control panel and grab tab, and the control panel contains these panes that can be collapsed or expanded using that arrow on the side of each pane. And to ask questions, please ask your questions in the questions pane. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. And please note that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording for playback will be available shortly after this broadcast is completed. I am Erica Carroll. I am the Education and Training Manager here at Atlona. And with me today is our Senior Sales Engineer, Nick Bethard. And we'll be hearing from Nick in a few moments, but first I'd like to thank you all for joining us today as we continue to unravel our feature sets in this velocity series. And today's focus is on control automation. And today we're going to be talking specifically about macros and room triggers. Just to recap, Velocity is an IP-based control platform that is comprised of very distinct components. And so far in this series, we've covered custom drivers within the Velocity Gateway, plus basic and advanced GUI options for that control interface. And to continue the conversation, today we're going to be talking about macros, and beyond that, we'll also discuss other automation features like event macros and room triggers. Let's see. So let's start with macros. What is a macro? Many of you may be familiar with a macro. That's built in Excel, and that's where you're capturing keystrokes and mouse clicks to make repetitive tasks easier to execute with just the click of a button. Now, that's the same concept that we're using here in Velocity. We're able to program a series of control commands that will fire with just one button. For example, let's say the way you're using a room changes. Maybe it's a restaurant that's going from daytime dining to like an open mic night. In this case, we need to control the technology in the room to lower the shades or adjust the lightings or even reroute audio or video distribution. And with just one macro, we can do all of these things with just the press of one button. We also have the ability to do boot macros. So once a macro is created and you want to make sure that a room state is always going to be the same at the beginning of the day, if for whatever reason your Velocity system needs to be rebooted, that boot macro will fire every time the Velocity system boots up. Next is event macros. Now, unlike macro buttons, event macros are triggered by something else in the system, not by a person pressing a button. A common event macro would be triggered from another event that occurs in the system. Something as simple as the time could trigger an event macro. With a scheduled time macro, the Velocity system will fire a series of commands at that specific time, either daily or weekly. So this is handy if at 7 a.m. every morning you want a room to turn on, and at 9 p.m. every night you want to be sure the room is turned off by the time everyone has gone home for the day. And finally, for automation, we'll cover room triggers. Now, a room trigger is a variation of an event macro. Event macros are triggered by the system, and these room triggers, these room triggers are triggered by the system listening to messages that are coming from a device that is configured in the room. And by utilizing a VCC, or Velocity Control Converter, the gateway can trigger a macro from something as simple as the open and close state of a relay. So with that introduction of controls, I'm going to go ahead and hand controls over to Nick so he can go over what each one of these does in a real life application.
Hey everybody, so give me 1 second. I will show you my screen. There we go. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to use sort of a scenario to show you guys what we're talking about here. And that scenario is going to be a simple divisible space. Now granted, for those of you that might be familiar with doing simple divisible spaces in Velocity, you might be thinking to yourself, this isn't the right way to do a simple two-way divisible space, and you'd be right. There's a simpler way than this. This is how we would do bigger divisible spaces, like a three-way, four-way, five-way divisible space. But I just thought it would be useful to show this method because it leverages all of the things that Erica was just talking about. Excuse me. So basically what we have is we have, a two-way divisible space. So there's basically, two states that each room can be in. They're either separate, the left side or the right side, or they're combined. So we've got all that set up. And then we've got a control room here. So I'm going to go into this control room because that's where all my macros and event triggers and all of that stuff is all set up. So if I go into room control options, then we see the screen with, under automation where we see our macros, event macros, room triggers, variables. One thing that, I want to mention, that we're going to use here is a little bit, is variables. So you can actually define, your own variables for the system to use, which you're going to see some of that here in what I've got set up. So basically, I made a variable. Now this is my test system, so it's got a lot of variables defined. But this variable right here, this airwall1 variable, is the variable that we are going to kind of leverage. And basically, what we're saying with this variable is whether the air wall is open or closed. So since it's a simple two-way space, there's only one air wall, so that's all we're worried about. So first, let me show you a regular macro. And again, this is, like Erica said, this is a macro that's going to happen because the user did something, on Velocity, and I'll show you that in a little while. So if I click into here, we see I basically set up an airwall toggle macro. And if I expand this guy down, basically what I did was I set up a simple if then else statement to toggle that variable open and closed using a button on the control panel. So basically I said if the airwall1 variable equals 0, then I'm going to change that to 1. Otherwise, if it's not equal to 0, that means it's equal to 1, so I'm going to toggle it back to 0. Very simple. And I'll show you that in action here in just a little while. So now that's kind of a manual way that gives us a manual way, to open and close the room, to open and close that air wall. What about an automated way? So we saw we have in the room, we have a VCC relay, that we could have connected to an airwall sensor, simple contact closure type output airwall sensor. So let's set up some automation. So as Erica kind of alluded to, the type of thing that we want to use here is a room trigger, because basically what we want to do is we want to listen to that VCC relay and listen for it to tell us that, its input is either open or closed. So if I go into room triggers, then we're going to see I've got a couple of room triggers set up based on that VCC relay. One is opened and one is closed. So basically, if that VCC relay sees that its sensor contact is open, then we're going to assume that the air wall is open, and that means that we're going to set the air wall variable to 0. 0 means open. And conversely, if it sees that sensor's contact closure is closed, then we're going to do the inverse. We're going to set that airwall1 variable to a value of 1. Okay, great. So what we've done is we've given a way to manually tell the system that the airwall is open or closed using the macro, or we've given it a way to automatically tell based on an airwall sensor. What do we do with that? We haven't actually done anything. So this is where we go into event macros. Because now what we want to do is we want to trigger things to happen based on that external event. or even the internal event, you know, again, based on that variable changing. So if we go into event macros, let's go here. Basically, I've got a couple of event macros set up here, one for room split, one for room combine. And, you know, as Erica kind of alluded to, there's a lot of internal events that you can trigger off of, things like the room turned on, the room turned off. You can schedule things to happen. But the thing that we're going to leverage here is variable updated. So basically, we're telling Velocity to watch for the airwall1 variable to be updated to a value of 1. And that means, because remember, airwall1 being equal to 1, that variable being equal to 1 means the room is split. So as soon as Velocity sees that the room is split, then it's going to go and it's going to execute this macro. And basically what we're doing is we're forcing the touch panels to navigate pages. So if the room is split, we're going to trigger you know, my control screen, you know, and I've got that open, and I've got those open in a couple of other browsers, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But the one that I've got open in Edge, I'm going to move to the webinar left room, and the other control screen I'm going to open to the webinar right room. Now, if somebody comes along and either hits that macro to toggle that variable, or somebody closes that air wall and triggers that VCC relay, then we're going to combine the room, or I'm sorry, not close the air wall, but open the air wall. We're going to combine that room into one big huge space. So Velocity is going to see that that variable is going to get updated to 0 for open, and it's going to execute a different couple of page navigations where it's going to navigate basically both control panels to the combined room. So we're going to see that happen here in just a little bit. So that's it. That's, you know, so here in a really simple little divisible space, we're going to make use of macros, event macros, and room triggers and variables all right here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up my couple of control surfaces. So there, now you can see using the beauty of Velocity's ability to basically make anything a control surface that has an HTML5 browser. I've got one control surface over here open in Edge, and I've got one control surface open over here in Firefox. Easy peasy. One for the left and one for the right. And I can, you know, navigate sources. You know, I can do all stuff. It's a control surface, no big deal. So these are separate and independent right now. But what happens is if I go and I hit this airwall toggle button, which again, this is just linked back to that macro that I showed you just a little while ago, then it's going to set that airwall variable. Right now we're in a split situation where the airwall's closed. So we're going to go ahead and open that airwall. We're going to toggle that variable by opening that airwall. And what we're going to see happen is both control surfaces are going to automatically react and navigate to the combined page. And so now they're actually shared control surfaces. So we can actually, you know, make a change on one, and we see that update on both simultaneously. You know, so if we go back here, now we see it update on both. And of course, we can go back and we can close that air wall again just by hitting air wall toggle, boom, and all of a sudden now the air wall is closed and the system reacted using that event macro that I showed, or the event macro I showed you. And we're back to a split situation where the touch panels are reflecting the individual rooms that they're now in. And that's it. Simple usage of macros, event macros, room triggers, and variables. So that's all I got.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. So there was a question that came in about the event macros. Is there a way to schedule a holiday or a special event calendar trigger?
I'm going to assume that that means, you know, basically to have regularly scheduled events, but then exclude certain holidays. We don't have that ability right now. It's actually not a bad idea. I'll report that to the product team. You know, you can definitely Um, you can set up regularly scheduled events, to occur on a recurring basis. And you could also set up, subsequent scheduled events to stop macros from firing. That's a capability that the system has. So you could probably kind of cobble something together, that way. But it's an interesting request that I'll pass along anyway.
Awesome. And can you elaborate as to what a boot trigger was? It was sort of breezed over.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should still be sharing my screen, right? Um, I'll actually go back here and we'll just go back in. And basically, so if you see, we have, the four things that we talked about, right? Macros, event macros, room triggers, and variables. And then underneath all that, we have this thing labeled boot macro. So basically what a boot macro is you can go into your macros and you can build a macro here. We'll just call it boot, just for, illustration purposes so you guys can see it. And then you can go in, you can add stuff, right? We're going to add a bunch of steps. And basically all of these things are things that are going to happen to put the room into a known state. So let's say that, scenario, right? Let's say that there's a power outage. And when the power comes back, you want the room to be in a predictable state for the user, right? So you could build this boot macro and then hide it so it's not visible to the user, and then build a bunch of stuff, right, to basically set the room up to a specified state, a known state. Input one is mapped to display one, that kind of stuff. The volume set to a certain, volume level, whatever you want. And then you can assign that macro here. Just refresh this guy, and we should be able to see, all of our macros here, including boot. So we can assign that as the boot macro for this room, so that if there's something like a power outage, when velocity boots back up, as soon as velocity comes up, it's going to execute that macro automatically. And that's
Great.
all it is.
Awesome. Thank you. We have one more question here. So we've been talking about custom GUIs in the last two webinars. Are these available in those custom GUIs?
Yes. And actually, these four functions, macros, event macros, room triggers, and variables, they really all get leaned on, as you dig into, building custom UIs and making custom UIs user friendly. These four things really get leaned on pretty heavily. In particular, variables and macros and event macros. Because you're going to want to have it so that, when a user pushes a button that you defined on the custom UI, it's going to do things, right? It's not just going to do one thing, it's going to do multiple things. And that's where, leveraging these things really comes in handy.
So you can also build out macros in the custom GUI. Is there any instance where you would use this macro builder over the one that's in the custom GUI for a button?
Yeah, it's a matter of organization, right? When you're building a room, especially a room that is going to be relatively complex, and use the same functions a lot. I actually like to place macros in here and then call them in the custom UI builder or wherever else. I'll show you an example. So if we go back in here, and I just expand this boot macro out just because I've got a lot of empty stuff. You can actually call macros inside of macros. So if I select my device's velocity, then one of the commands that I've got as an option is run macro. So I hit that run macro, and now I've got access to all of the different macros in the system that I can call right from here. So rather than having to, if you have a process that you're going to, call a number of different times, rather than having to define that process, across all the different buttons, a lot of times I think it makes sense to define it once in here, and then just in the buttons, tell the buttons to run that macro. It's good organizationally, but then it's also good for maintenance, because if later on you figure out that, oh, I made a mistake and I need to change a value in that process, then now you're going and changing it in one place instead of having to go to every individual button that you've used that process in the UI, that you built.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And we've recently introduced that there's a Velocity 2.0 coming out in January. Is there any difference in the procedure between this and what will be released in 2.0?
No, no, all of this remains exactly the same. The differences, around Velocity 2.0 are primarily have to do with how it's licensed, especially as it pertains to some of the new features coming out, like room scheduling. But all of this functionality, the macro stuff, all the automation stuff is all absolutely exactly the same. I mean, the actual process of how you build rooms isn't going to change at all.
Okay, great. So that pretty much wraps up all the questions that we have for today. If you have any additional questions that may come up after this webinar is complete, feel free to reach out to either Nick or myself. The easiest way to reach us is probably at training@atlona.com, and we'll make sure that you're taken care of. I appreciate your time today. Thank you, Nick, for this thorough walkthrough, and I hope you all have a wonderful Thursday.